So my name is Nina Freeman. I am based in Portland, Oregon right now. I'm a game designer. Gosh, I just turned 30 this year, I guess. And I'm like, how old am I? I forget. And right now I'm working on my own stuff. I stream games on Twitch and work on games full time. Like I'm my own boss kind of deal. Right now I'm working on a horror game set in a department store that's based on a personal story. And yeah, I guess I'm known for making that kind of thing. Lots of personal games, vignette games, narrative-focused stuff. I think the most well-known things I've worked on are probably Sybil and How Do You Do It, which I was designer on, and also Tacoma at Fulbright, where I used to work, where I was a level designer.
Right.
And typically my personal work, like Sybil and How Do You Do It, was made with on teams, and I work as the designer, but there's a lot of other cool people that worked on those too, often under the label Star Made Games. And yeah, that's sort of my brief background and the most known things that I think I've worked on.
Yeah, cool. No, it's just to give a little bit of context for maybe people who aren't familiar with you and your work. So I don't really know, like, if I was being asked this question, like, if I had, your career, I think it's hard to answer questions like this, but it's an interesting starting point, which is, like, what interests you in kind of making smaller, personal, almost bordering on, like, confessional games? Like, how is that sort of a thing that you latched onto, and how is that a thing that you came to learn, like, oh, you really like doing and want to continue doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, the stories that I like to tell are really inspired by like how I learned to write. So originally when I went to undergrad for college at Pace University, and I had a mentor there named Charles North, and he's a poet. And I got really into poetry there, and that's what I was doing before games. I was like working in the poetry world, and that was like where I did all my internships as a student and stuff. So nothing to do with games, just all poetry all the time. And I was really into New York school poets who were writing in, like, I guess that was like the 70s and 80s. I forget the exact dates, but people who were writing really personal stuff. So poets like Frank O'Hara and Elizabeth Bishop I find really inspiring. And they were, writing about their lives, writing about ordinary people as well. So I really learned to write from studying work like that. And I think that has stuck with me through my transition from like doing poetry stuff into games. I've sort of brought that interest over. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and I think in poetry, it's really pretty typical for people to draw from their personal lives and their work, and that is, not something all poets do, but that's something that's pretty common there and something that I was personally really into when I was in that world and writing poetry stuff mostly. So yeah, I guess my interest in it really started there.
So when you were learning that, did you have a mind towards like wanting to cross-pollinate that way of thinking into games, or was making games not even on your mind when you were sort of absorbing that stuff in school?
Oh yeah, it wasn't even on my mind yet. I didn't even really know about the concept of indie games or like small games, or even that there was like game developers my own age until after I finished undergrad. So in my, I guess, early 20s, like 23, I guess that was 2013. So after I finished undergrad, I was still doing poetry stuff, but I wasn't like working in the poetry world. I was working at another job to support myself, and suddenly I found myself making some new friends after I finished college, and a bunch of those friends included folks like Diego Garcia, Emmett Butler, who was my partner at the time. They were making games and really into indie games and introduced me to that world. Mm-hmm. Also Decky Koss, all people who I ended up working with later. So through my friends, I discovered this world, and I discovered Baby Castles, and NYU Game Center was just getting started, so they were running events. So suddenly through my social group, I became involved in the games world and started going to game jams and stuff. And, I was writing poetry too, so I think the like the relationship between my poetry work and games work, I think happened kind of naturally, not like by any deliberate choice. It's just like that I became interested in games, and the way I knew how to write was to write about personal stuff, so that just naturally got carried over, I think, once I started doing those game jams with friends and stuff like that.
I mean, I remember, I guess it was last week when we were emailing about talking. It feels like 30 years ago now. I really appreciated like some of what you're talking about here, which is like you're encouraging or desire to encourage people to sort of, reach out of their own bubbles, in games, outside of games, maybe not to think of the world in those binaries. So like as someone who makes games and, came from a different bubble, if you will, like what are kind of like, I don't know if I want to say like benefits, but I'm curious, like, do you feel like, are you speaking a different language often from other people who maybe are a little bit more single-minded towards games, or like, are there benefits you feel like you have from coming from a different backyard, if you will?
Yeah, totally. I think like games and other forms of media, whether it's poetry or film or whatever, have so much more in common than I think people typically like think about. Although in some ways I'm hesitant to say that because I feel like it's a pretty common sentiment these days to be like, don't just play games, like read books too, it'll help you. Right. So I think people do know this to a certain extent. I don't know how often they act on it necessarily because, games can be very time consuming, and I know I play way more games than I like read books, for example, so I'm no better. I also really immerse myself in it. But I think having come from the poetry background and having that stuff in my back pocket always has helped me a lot. Because I don't know, I find it funny because I think now people making games about their personal lives and stuff, it's a lot more common, or at least more talked about. And when I was getting started making games in like 2013 or whatever, I think it was maybe considered more new and more like out of the ordinary, or I don't know what the right term is, but people were more surprised by it than they maybe are now. So I'm glad that it's becoming less surprising because it's like a great way to make work. And I think that's because people are more open to this idea of like engaging with other mediums. And I think it helps me a lot because poetry has such a long history and there's a lot to learn from it. I'm trying to think, there's a lot of famous examples like Allen Ginsberg and all of his issues with writing really controversial work that, got him sent to court. And seeing that controversies and stuff like that happened in poetry during that era, like you see similar things happen in games where remember, I was looking at this the other day because I've been playing Mass Effect, but all the drama around there being like sex in Mass Effect and the news covering it, and it was like this big controversy. These kinds of controversies have happened in other mediums before, so I think it's important to look at the history of other mediums to see how we're kind of repeating those histories in many ways. Sure. And I think we can learn from those and prepare better for them if we're educating ourselves on what has already happened. I think that's another benefit. I don't know. It's such a complicated question to answer, but that's kind of the first things that pop into my head. I think it's very useful to know.
No, yeah, you're good. I mean, I think it's hard to articulate too, but I do wonder and I realized at school, if last week for me at least feels like it's been 30 years, school probably feels like it's been even longer for you, but are there lessons or things that and I don't want to continue to harp on your schooling, but are there North Stars that maybe you learned about in your schooling, specifics that you think have helped guide the way you think about or approach making games, or maybe even just talking about them?
Well, I guess for poetry, really the main thing I carried over was the openness to talk about myself. I think one challenge for a lot of people is personal work can be hard to do because it's scary to put yourself out there. And I really had to do that because I was in these poetry classes where I was writing every week and reading my work to the class, reading things about my sex life to my fellow students who were sitting there physically in front of me. And I got used to that openness, I think, because of those sort of workshop style classes and, from the encouragement of my mentor and because he saw that I wanted to embrace that stuff, so he encouraged me to engage in it, and those always felt like really positive spaces for sharing personal work. So I think I gained a lot of confidence in myself and my ability to tell those stories by doing that. Whereas with games, sometimes making games can be a very isolated process. I mean, there are games, like I ended up getting a master's at NYU in integrated digital media, so I was able to do workshop classes like that for games. But, I feel like typically games are often more worked on in isolation and then put on the internet, and you don't actually get to, see the faces of all your players. I got to see the faces of my readers in class.
Right.
So I think that can make it a little more intimidating to really put your personal life into your work. So I think, I benefited a lot from being in classes where I was able to do that, to get used to it and become comfortable doing it in all kinds of work.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds like in some ways maybe it made you more mindful of how there are, because I've it's not the same as poetry, but I took creative writing classes, for example, in school, which is not quite exactly where I landed as a writer professionally, but even those few classes I have, it's burned into my mind, the faces people make when you're reading your stuff.
Yeah.
The kind of ways they react. I wonder, if in some subconscious way, it's made you more conscious of, where the things you're making might lose people. So even if it's in isolation, you still have other people in your head. But, I feel like there are other challenges, with the stuff that you make where, it's stuff where you're being vulnerable, but then there's still, iterating, reiterating, working thoroughly. I'm basically in some cases presenting chapters from your life. I guess if there's a question in there, what are kind of the challenges that are unique to working on stuff that's based on a lived experience as opposed to something that's coming from a more, I don't know, it feels disrespectful to say from a fictional place, but it's obviously coming from a different place, I guess I would say.
I don't know. I'm not sure, really, because, it's just what I love to write, so I never think of it as, a challenge, and that's why I feel like it probably comes from, getting used to it in that poetry context. And also, I think it matters that I personally enjoy engaging with work like that from other people.
Yeah.
So I'm, kind of, making what I want to see, which makes it easier, I think, in a lot of ways. It's, something I'm used to engaging with, and I seek out that work on my own from other people, too. So in many ways, I'm following the example of people whose work I'm into as well. But I'm trying to think of what challenges have come up for me.
Maybe challenge is too strong of a word, but I think that because I guess what I was sort of interested in was presenting things you've lived through, having to bug test and iterate and reiterate. I think for me it feels like it's more involved than, say, just writing prose. I think there's something different going on in the brain.
I think my answer to that would be I have an example. When I was working on Sybil, I learned a lot about the process of, writing a personal story on a larger scale, because with How Do You Do It, for example, which came before Sybil, that's a much more focused experience. It's very much sort of one image in the end. There wasn't much extra stuff to that story. The experience itself was very minimal, although it obviously carried a lot of weight despite being such a small moment. Whereas with Sybil, if folks don't know it, Sybil is a game about an experience I had. I used to play a lot of Final Fantasy online, and when I was a teenager, and I had sort of an online boyfriend situation in there, and we ended up meeting up and having sex, and that's what the game is about. So that whole life experience of mine is a much larger experience that took place over multiple years. And there's a lot of subtleties to a relationship like that. Lots of conversations that happen over all of those years that lead to those moments that the game depicts. But I only had an hour or so within the context of the game to express that stuff. So I quickly had to learn how to take a story with lots of subtleties like that and boil it down to its most essential parts so that I could get those feelings across to the player that I was experiencing at the time.
Yeah.
So with Sybil, there was a lot of like life experiences there that I cut from the game that are important to me in terms of my memory of that relationship, but might be confusing to the player or might sort of muddy the final, picture that I wanted to depict of the story. So I think, a really important thing that I learned that was a challenge at first was just like learning to like cut parts of my own life out of the story in order to make it simple enough for the player to understand and like step into my shoes during that experience. Because ultimately the players and I don't have the same life experiences, so I just have to like take the key, most sort of like clear and obvious things from my life to like depict that to the players and like let them understand the story through that without overwhelming them with information. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen you talk about it where like you're creating games that enable people to feel like an actor, although in this case it's like the actor is playing you. And so, if it isn't too personal, and I would guess that that's some of the editing that you remove too is maybe stuff that you would rather, keep to yourself, although like what do you feel you've maybe learned about yourself in empowering others to play as you?
I think when I cut stuff from the story, it's not necessarily stuff that I'm like embarrassed about or don't want to show.
Sure.
I'll cut stuff if I'm playtesting and it's in there and the player's like see. I wish I had like a concrete example. It's just been so long.
Yeah.
Okay, actually, no, I do have a good example. So in my relationship with this guy that, is in Sybil, him and I had lots of conversations that had like sort of a lot more of him like teasing me or being kind of like rude in an internet boy way, which might, or would definitely make most of the players of my games just like hate him completely from the beginning and throughout. But I wanted them to feel like me, where like I was okay with that when I was that age, and like I don't agree with that now, but that's how it was for me at the time, and I want the player to step into that girl's shoes. So I had to actually hold back on some of his language as I remembered it in order to like know that my players now would be able to understand my feelings of like being into him. Does that kind of make sense? So it's not that I was like embarrassed or afraid to show that stuff. It's just that like if I had presented him like exactly 100% as I remembered him, then I wouldn't be able to get those same feelings across to my players. So it's more of like a curation of memories, and like it's never the full like 100% truth, because sometimes the truth is too confusing. It's more about how I remember it and how I want the player to experience it in my work. That's why I don't usually refer to my work as autobiographical, because I think it's sort of a mixture of things.
Yeah, I mean, do you bristle? Like, I've seen a bunch of words. Like, I think I saw you use the word actor, but like, I didn't know like if you would scoff at my using the word confessional, or I didn't know if you would scoff at my use of the word vulnerable. Like,
I guess. I mean, people use those words a lot. I guess I don't. It doesn't like bother me or anything, but it's not really how I think of my own work, because it's like I guess I think of my personal stories as more like characters. I don't even use, like, I don't say it's me in the game. I usually refer to myself in the third person.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it feels different for me. I kind of separate myself from the stories. Even though it is my stories, I treat it pretty clinically, to be honest.
No, I understand. And I think, like, based on what you were saying, it sounds like it's less confessional and it's more like exploration of, like, how we're all kind of works in progress, rather than like, here's a definitive thing I'm saying about myself.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Though. I don't know.
I think that's part of it. I just want, like, I'm never trying, or usually I'm not trying to make, like, statements about myself or the characters in my work. I just want to present them as I remember them.
Right.
And I guess the point I was trying to make before is that sometimes in order to present someone in the light that I remember them, I need to like fudge the truth a little bit to like get that point across to like a current audience.
Right. Well, you're telling a story.
So,
you're telling a story.
Yeah.
You're not like making a documentary.
Yeah, exactly. And I think people often misinterpret my work as like being autobiographical, and I don't really think of it that way. So that's always something that I end up coming back to. I'm like, it's very crafted. It's all very purposeful.
Right.
Even if it's not like, I'm like, especially with Sybil, it's not like a nice story. It's not really got a happy ending.
Yeah.
So that's on purpose, because I look back on that and it was like a painful experience.
Right.
So I crafted it to make sure that the player came away with that feeling, or at least that was my hope. So yeah, it's complicated, but this process is like, I write lots of versions and I like play test it and I see how players react and I ask them like, what do you think the character's thinking, or like, how do you feel about this? And I'll sort of edit the story based on that.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I see things differently than a lot of people, and I just try to like play test a lot to make sure that my ideas are coming across clearly, and I edit the storytelling based on that,
right,
rather than just trying to stick 100% to like the truth as I remember it.
So you talked
more about getting that feeling across.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about like kind of what the horizon seemed like, or what possibilities seemed like, 7 years ago or so. And I guess like, do you have a sense of like what doors seem to be open now for making these kinds of games, like that maybe culturally didn't seem like there would be much of a interest, or I guess like the question is like, what seems possible now in making these kinds of games that maybe didn't 7 years ago, as these kind of games are becoming a little bit more common, as you were saying.
Yeah, it's weird, because actually in a lot of ways I feel like it's harder now than it was 7 years ago. Yeah, I mean, I think there's more games like that are personal or small or exploring ordinary life stuff from the perspective of the creator,
right,
because we have more accessible tools within the industry. Like, you can use Unity for free and Game Maker, and there's all these different tutorials that you can find. Being a self-taught game developer is, I think, really accessible to people now, as long as they can have, a computer for it, which is a high barrier to entry, to be honest. Computers are expensive. But there's a lot of people who do have access to that stuff. So you see, if you go on itch.io, right, there's a wealth of games like that. And I think that that's really inspiring. I was just going through, do you know Warp Door?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I I knew of Warp Door, but only really looked at it in depth very recently. And I was like, oh yeah, remember that site, Free Indie Games?
Yeah.
That was the first site to cover anything that I worked on. And I remember that made such a difference in my confidence in making that kind of work. And the fact that they got the word out about early things I worked on really encouraged me to keep doing it. And, that site's gone now. And I didn't know of another site like it that was signal boosting that kind of work in that way. And then I found Warp Door, and I was like, oh yeah, this is kind of like what Free Indie Games was in a way, except they're not really writing, I don't see as many articles, but it's still signal boosting work that is not as visible. So I think that I'm really glad to see stuff like that still going on, because it kind of went away for a little while there.
Yeah.
And I feel like the work that typically gets signal boosted as indie now is larger work by studios that have lots of funding from fancy publishers and stuff.
Right.
And in many ways, I worry that the small, people without any money backing them releasing things on itch.io have been kind of forgotten in these conversations within the last 5 years. Warp Door gave me a little hope for that. They're covering it, and that's awesome, and I like to see people engaging with that. But, after a lot of those sites went away that were covering the truly small indie stuff, I got a little demoralized. So hopefully it'll get better soon. I think there's definitely that work, and a lot of people are making it. It's just not as visible right now.
So you're saying it's harder because, not in terms of barriers to entry, but barriers of awareness.
Yeah.
Like the work that others are doing to sort of signal boost, as you said, and people sort of putting a spotlight on. Do you feel like, how has the character of that changed? I feel like when I started out writing about games and would even write criticism or things to try to do signal boosting, like I always felt that, well, why does the world need, another person writing about Call of Duty, for example, or the Call of Duties of the world? Like, there's no shortage of people who are interested in it. There are no shortage of people who know about it, and people can absolutely love those games. I do feel that too, that there has been, I don't know if it's a loss of curiosity or if it's just strictly economics. Like as that interest has sort of, or as that ability has sort of gone away, do you feel like the things that tend to be spotlighted, like you were talking about types of teams of that size, do you think that, like, how has the character of that changed? Like, stuff that does get the spotlight from smaller teams, like, sorry, I'm asking like 10 questions at once.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, I think
it's a big conversation.
Yeah, I think you know where I'm going with it, but like I'm curious, like, what your sense is of, like, as stuff has gotten harder to signal boost like this, like, what does seem to be signal boosted instead? That's probably the most concise way I know to ask that question.
Yeah.
It took me a couple paragraphs to get there. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I totally understand.
Yeah.
Okay, so I see it like this. I follow, like, the Independent Games Festival, right? I've been very involved with it in the past. Mm-hmm. And I adore it. I'm super biased because I hosted it and have, like, been on teams that have won awards from it. So, like, I admit to all that, like, totally biased. But I've always adored, finding work through the Independent Games Festival, and I've always admired it. Mm-hmm. And in recent years, I've really, like, started thinking more deeply about the kinds of games that are in it. And I think it's really interesting. And I will preface this by saying I adore Subnautica. It's, like, a really good game, and I really, really like it. But I find it interesting that a game like that was, like, submitted in the IGF, because it's such a big studio. They have so much money. It's just, like, so much. And how I just sometimes think about it, I'm like, I can't believe, like, something, like, I think of, like, how do you do it, how we made it. There was only, like, 3 of us working on it, or 4 of us. And we made it at Global Game Jam in, like, 3 days. It's such, like, a small thing. It's, like, so small and was made in such a scrappy fashion. And to think of that being set up against something the scale of Subnautica with the amount of money behind it is just, I think about it, I'm like, wow. Like, why are we putting those games in the same category still? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
And, like, the same as things, like, that have publishing deals with, like, whether it's Annapurna or Devolver or Xbox, whatever. Like, I think that stuff is all great, and I fully support it. But I kind of wish we weren't putting these, like, really concise, small games made by people without money up and, like, in these spaces like games festivals. I wish there was, like, a way to differentiate between the two and, like, be able to signal boost both, but maybe separately, because I feel like those bigger games are often so, it's just, I don't know, like, they have marketing budgets. They can get tons of eyes on their games already. Like, right. I wish there was a space for, like, the smaller stuff to just be on its own and, like, signal boosted for what it is and not have to, like, compete with that stuff. Does that kind of make sense?
It does. I think about this a lot, and you're kind of reviving stuff I've maybe just learned through just all the years of doing these interviews to talk about less because, various reasons. I mean, like, I used to always find it disorienting and would harp on, like, the same reason, like, I asked you about, confessional or vulnerable, like, and I'm kind of glad that you brought this up, too, in, in our emails before, where you were talking about, like, there needs to be, like, a better terminology around people who are making games. Like, I think this is what you're talking about. And you were zeroing in on indie, still used to describe, your words here, scrappy or low-budget games. And I always just found it disorienting, like, when I started writing about games coming from just, like, broader arts and entertainment writing, like indie makes me think of certain things in music, and it makes me think of certain things in film. Like, in film, it makes me think of, like, I guess things that kind of resemble, like, what you're doing, things that are a although sorry to regurgitate these words again, like things that are like indie films are things that are a little personal, things that are maybe a little bit different and that are taking certain creative risks. And I've always found the use of the word indie to just mean independent in games is not a useful word to understand. Like if it's independent, it kind of reminds me of like alternative rock or alternative comedy, where it's like it's like alternative to what? It's still rock. It's still comedy. And like in games, and I'm not sure if there's a question in here, but I find the fixation on budget from like the customer side to be a little bit confusing too, where like you can get equal enjoyment from a game that you spent 50 cents on or $50 on, and I don't know why that matters as much as it seems to, as if one is superior to the other, because like the other way I think about it too is it's like it's not like in terms of signal boosting, it's not like you have to reach for a different computer or like a keyboard that's farther away. Like it would be just as easy to signal boost these things that you're talking about as things that seem to belong in a different category. And I guess if there's a question in there, it's just I'm not sure, unless it's just like search engine optimization, I'm not sure why that seems to, like, is it like are games missing like a certain entity? Are they missing certain figures or advocates? Or like why are these things that are just as easy to discover treated as if they're not?
Sometimes I wonder, like, I think a lot about how when I got started, I was working, like, all the early stuff I worked on was Flash games, and made using Adam Saltzman's, like, Flixel, open source library, and it was really typical for people to, like, seek out Flash or web-based web browser games. Yeah. And I feel like that was a really healthy time for games without any budget, because they were easy to find. Everyone knew you could just play it in the browser. It was just an expected thing you would look out for. And now with stuff like Flash dying and like, I mean, there's itch where you have embedded games, but people don't talk about them. I'm wondering if people aren't seeking them out as much for whatever reason, because like stuff like Flash is just like uncool now or whatever. It almost seems like people hating on Flash almost like it feels like to me they're just like hating on the history of web games, because like that's where a lot of people who are making stuff without any budget got their start, at least within my generation. And now I'm wondering where younger developers are getting that same base. Like, I think it's itch, but is it itch? I don't know. Are people actually going on there and finding these games and playing them like they used to?
I think so.
I hope they are. I know I am. That's why I look through Warped Door. I mean, but then I wonder why those games don't go viral as much as they used to. I'm like, are people just lazy now and they don't want to go to itch and look at these games? Like, I don't understand.
I think that's it, though. I mean, like, because I agree. I think it feels like a different base. Like, itch doesn't quite feel the same as, like, Game Jolt or one of those types of sites or things that I haven't thought about in, like, 10 or 15
No, Newgrounds.
Newgrounds.
The classic.
Thank you. That's what I meant to say. And that's crazy, because, like, I used to spend a lot of time on there, and now I'm, like, forgetting their names. But, like, I have heard that from other developers where there's also, like, I've heard from other developers, like, there's this feeling like, well, game critics don't really want to play or write about those games because no one will pay them to write about those games. But there's also this feeling that, like, other developers are, like, I don't know why, like why is opening Steam so much easier than opening itch? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Especially because a lot of those itch games are, like, web embed still. Yeah. So it's basically, like, the same process of, like, going to someone's website and playing a Flash game. It's something, and I don't know what the answer to this is. Like, I don't know if it's people being lazy or, like, if it's because sites like Free Indie Games are gone, but it definitely feels like the conversation has changed, and I wish I knew why.
Yeah. So, I mean, if it's not laziness, or if laziness is part of it, you had talked about, like, different terms. Like, is there better terminology that, like, you wish people would use or think about using, or different categories of terminology?
Yeah, I think, and yes, I think that it would be great if, And I feel like I also kind of hate the conversation because there's just been like so many repeated conversation about like what does indie even mean, and I'm like part of me is sick of it, but also part of me is like, oh, but it really does matter. God damn it.
I'm with you. I think that's also a part of why I just sort of sunsetted that, because I remember it would come up early on in interviews like 5 years ago. And people would feel like, I think there was like this little tone of like adversarial like nature to it, where it's like I have to prove to David that indie does mean the things that I think it means, and it's so like it's peripheral to the thing I'm actually curious about. Because on the other hand, words matter, and the way we, it shapes the way we think about it. So I'm conflicted, and I'm glad you're similarly torn about it, because at least that means I'm not annoying you about it.
No, it doesn't. I annoy myself like with the amount I think about it. Like, but my worry is that because we still use the term indie, and because it's always just like been this nebulous thing, I'm worried that now our use of it is causing things like bigger games with tons of money behind them to be the indie games that are talked about in the place of the actual like small games without any budget that I think are truly indie. It's like the term is almost like letting those games take up all of the space, and there's no room left for those small games that don't have the budget to put themselves out there, or that don't have the visibility to put themselves out there. So I'm worried that the term is almost like causing this silencing effect of that world of work. And that's why I'm like, I wish the term would just go away completely and we could have new ones so that I could be like, where's the festival for games with no budget? Like, can I go look at that stuff instead of like...
Yeah.
And I speak about this also from experience. I worked at Fulbright for a really long time.
Right.
And that's a company that's considered indie, but like I worked there, I had a salary, I had benefits. I don't think of indie as having that. For me, that's not how I think of it. So I always found it really funny that Fulbright's considered indie now. And now I'm working on my own, like truly. I don't have a publisher. I don't have funding for my current project other than the support from my stream, which is massive, and that's community support, and I appreciate that so deeply. But it is different from having the backing of a big company, which I would take, to be fair. I would take it. But I would probably start... I would start talking about my work in a different way, because I don't want to take up that space. I want these creators with zero funding and only the ability to put stuff up on itch, who can't afford the fee to put it up on Steam, to have that spotlight. Like, that's what I want. That's why I love Warped Door.
Yeah, I mean, there has to be a way to talk about it where it doesn't seem to imply, like, valorizing or romanticizing struggle. Like, I think it's like... Yeah. I think it gets to like philosophically like what is driving the people making these types of games that like I think you and I are on the same wavelength of, where it's like, oh, it would be cool if yes, there is more of them, but also that's another annoying word, is like then there's the curation problem. Like it's like we need to start totally from scratch and find new, less annoying words.
I don't know what it is. It bothers me.
It's above our pay grade. But I always wonder, like, because like you do see things like that, like like the Annapurnas of the world getting into games, and I always wonder, like, how do these games that I guess are kind of positioned like like games that are taking certain creative risks, like. Maybe this isn't the way you think about it, but this is another thing I think about all the time, like, which probably came through with the questions I asked you over email. Like, how is it that quote unquote normal people, how does it like broaden, like the people who hear about these types of games taking certain risks? How does it help them reach different types of people? Because I feel like there is like a different bit of a feedback loop happening there, where we call certain things indie. Sorry to bring that word again. I thought we were moving away. Well, we call certain things that, but it's not like pushing towards new people. Maybe that's too much of a blanket statement, but that's kind of a feeling I've had, and like I've talked to other people about it in the past, and they always say like, oh, well, send those people to me and I'll let them know about those games. But there needs to be something in the ecosystem, I feel, where those games have a chance of reaching new people so that we can bring new people into the space. I mean, I think you're an example of someone who wound up kind of landing in games didn't expect to, and it's pretty evident like why your work is interesting, because it's so, maybe that's not the way you feel about it anymore, but like just on the surface of it, like, oh, there's something different and interesting happening here. Like I think that's part of my concern is like we keep thinking about these things in certain ways, or we like pass the responsibility to certain outposts, but I don't know. I guess like what am I saying? Like we need to see numbers on like who's reaching what games and how. I think it's harder to track the butterfly effect of culture, but maybe you agree or disagree. I don't even know if I agree with myself as I'm.
It's hard. I think you saying all that is reminding me of like two examples that I want to bring up. Right. One is an interesting thing. Well, one, I think we're both in the indie game bubble, so maybe it's hard for us to like see outside of that at times. I like try to be self-aware about that. Like I get a lot of like this knowledge from just like my Twitter feed, but that's so limited. So maybe some of these things, maybe some of my opinions about this stuff would change if I could somehow expand my bubble, which I try to.
Right.
And an important part of that for me has been my activity doing like Twitch streaming stuff. You know, ever since I left Fulbright and started streaming like semi-full-time, I stream like 20 hours a week now, basically. Through doing that, I've been able to connect with a lot of people that are like not in like indie game dev sphere on Twitter or whatever at all. Right. And it's been really enjoyable to like connect with those people and like play. I had a really good stream experience playing through the Haunted PS1 demo disc collection, which is a collection of these games that are really small games made by teams, as far as I know, like without backing of any kind for any of them financially. And I played through that collection of games. It was some of the most interesting work I've encountered this year, or even in the past couple of years. I highly recommend it. And I streamed that collection, and the response from my community was super positive, and people were just like, what is this? And it felt really good to be able to, like, share that with people, and I think that it's easy to forget how big of an audience Twitch as a website has, and how people like who have never heard of my games work follow me on Twitch. So I'm like able to reach people that are just finding me through that sphere. And that's just been, I think, a really exciting experience for me in a way that I've like tried to like get out of my little indie games bubble. And so far so good. Like sometimes people will come in and be like, what are these games? They look broken. Are these like weird old, like what are these bad graphics? And I'm like, listen, this is cool PSX style art, and I love it, and you love it, or I'm going to be sad. I don't say it like that. But, you know, it's like I can curate what I share with this audience and, like, introduce them to stuff that would be harder for them to find otherwise. And, like, a lot of them will openly be like, I don't like this. This is weird. And it's nice to have a direct conversation between them in the chat and me, and I can, like, help tell them why I like it. And sometimes I win them over, and that feels really good. And to piggyback on that, I think the Haunted PS1 demo collection is a really good example of devs banding together and, like, having this sort of, like, mass energy of a group that, like, I think they did pretty well with that demo. I saw it going around all over the place, and I was really glad it did because there's some really talented devs in there, and I think that it worked out so well partially because they did it as a group. So I thought that that was a really successful experiment in, like, signal boosting the group's work. So that, between that and the Twitch stream, those are two things I've been thinking about for, like, how do we get these games in front of more people? And I think the bundle and streaming are both possibly good ways.
So we should bring back the web ring, maybe?
Wait, the what?
The web ring?
Oh, web rings, yes.
Sorry,
I love web rings.
I don't know what that sounded like. I know I can...
I thought you said lead ring. I was like, what's a lead ring? It's okay. It's just internet audio.
Maybe. I'm going to put a pin in that one for now, though. But no, it's interesting, like, because I always ask about, like, the questions that I asked you on email, which is, like, how do we make, like, capital V video games, lowercase v video games seem, you know, less in the weeds? And I honestly don't even know if there is such a thing as like mainstream culture anymore, and I know games are not a monolith, and I know that like you kind of pointed to like the quarantine era that we're in now, and Animal Crossing is a good example of, you know, games sort of waking up and remembering, you know, oh, video games are a thing you can think about. But I wonder if the model is less like waiting for the mainstream to really remember, and it's more this model that you're talking about of um, uh, yeah, that sort of like collaborative spirit of, I don't know, because the word community often confuses me too. And I see it thrown around in games a lot too. Maybe it's not a this or that, but I wonder if it is more, you know, the sort of interaction you're talking about rather than, you know, whatever publication it is being like, hey, Animal Crossing, it's a thing. Like, I wonder if that's a more powerful thing, the exchanges you're talking about, those exchanges.
Where it's like a one-on-one kind of conversation, like that would happen with me in the chat,
right?
On Twitch.
I guess, like you say it out loud, it sounds obvious, but maybe you disagree. Maybe you feel like the other direction is more impactful.
No, I think it's really important to remember that personal conversation can go so far, because like, I feel like, especially in like indie dev sphere historically, like I've had a lot of conversations with like other devs who kind of like maybe look down on Twitch streamers or YouTubers and are like, they're just raging or whatever, like they're just using our work to get views or whatever. And I think that's sort of like, that's an unfortunate conversation that I've heard happen a lot. And I think that there are streamers and YouTubers that suck and that say bad things and are terrible people, and I don't like them. Right. But there's also a really good chance to go there and find cool people that do want to signal boost interesting work and that are willing to put the emotional energy into having these conversations to like show their communities and their viewers what these different kinds of games are that are not the ones that are like advertised to them on Twitch or right. that are not advertised on TV or whatever, that aren't on the homepage of their Xbox. Like, people, I think, want to naturally like connect with others on a personal basis, and that's part of what makes streaming so powerful, because you can feel like you're hanging out with a person, which, you know, the parasocial relationship thing is like a whole nother conversation to have.
Yes.
But I won't get into that here.
Which we could have, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a whole thing. But really what I'm trying to say is, like, you know, I'm the type of person who, like, I'm excited to have those conversations with people, to be like, here's a cool game. You don't get it? Let's talk about it. And, like, I think that offers such a great opportunity to maybe find these new ways of talking about indie games or whatever. Like, have those conversations with people who are new to it and see what comes out of it. Try to win people over and get them to be interested in these games that they may have never known about before. I think it's a lot of emotional labor, and not everyone can do it, and not everyone has to do it, but right. I like doing it, and it makes me feel happy and fulfilled, and I think more conversations like that could help the medium move forward more, given the prevalence of platforms like Twitch that right. do enable those conversations.
So I don't know why, like, I had a momentary thing where I was, like, partially surprised hearing you say, because I guess I just haven't heard as much about it, like developers sort of scoffing at streaming for whatever reason. Because I've definitely heard a lot of people on my quote-unquote side of the aisle, you know, in the writer-critic side, I've heard them, I guess because, like, it's kind of felt like Twitch sort of, you know, has taken opportunities from writers. But I think that there's another thing going on here. Like the criticism you're talking about from other developers, how much of it do you think is just, I don't want to say that they're old, but how much of it do you think it is like that sort of generation gap of streaming is weird and I didn't have streaming when I was coming up and streaming is bad?
I don't know. Maybe it's partially that, and also, you know, there's lots of conversations happening for a while where it was like, if people watch my game on Twitch or whatever, they won't buy it, and there was that fear. But I think hopefully we've all collectively decided that that's not true. I don't know. I feel like that question has been passed. Yeah. But, like, there's been conversations like that, or, like, a lot of really visible streamers are toxic and do promote toxic gamer culture and like flaming and all these terrible things.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to just see the entire space as those people, and I always want to tell people, like, it's not just them. There are cool people doing good work in the space, and they may not be the most visible, but they are certainly there and do have big audiences and are doing really well. And I think it's easy to just, like, dismiss streams and YouTube stuff by, like, looking at that surface level, the surface level of the most visible people doing it. And I think if you look beyond that, then people would understand. But I think a lot of devs have maybe only seen the surface of it in the past.
Yeah.
Then again, I haven't gotten to go to an event in like a year, so maybe the conversation, the casual like hallway conversations around that have changed. But that's what I remember it being when I was able to go outside.
Well, yeah. I wonder if that's gonna be an unexpected ripple from this time. Is maybe streaming will seem less weird to more people. Like, I don't know, like that's my sense, like, from where I sit, is a lot of people have that attitude that you were talking about, but you were talking about it like in your group of developers, and that kind of surprised me. I mean, do you think that like that attitude is more of a minority outlier attitude, or do you have a sense of like what the quote unquote mainstream, that's another word that drives me nuts, their perception of streaming's appeal, or like, is it less derisive now, or does it seem weird still? Like, I feel like I mainly hear from people who think it's great or think it's weird. Nothing in between.
Yeah, and when I'm talking about, like, devs not liking streamers or streamer culture or whatever, like, that might be different now, but those are the conversations I remember, like, last GDC at least.
Right, and to be clear,
but,
like,
a lot has changed since then.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that it's, like, a monolithic thing that, like, comes into, obviously these are individuals we're talking about, yeah. Yeah.
And I think it is easy to have that outlook because, like, all the stuff that's happened with Ninja over the last year, it's like, oh my God. Like, it does make you want to roll your eyes. But I feel like that's just, like, a generalization. But, yeah, I don't know. The feeling right now in this moment must be different because I see more and more, like, developers and industry people, like, going to Twitch because quarantine is happening and, like, using that as a way to connect with their friends and maybe inevitably with their audience. Like, whether they mean to or not. I think a lot of people are doing it for social reasons, but I wouldn't be surprised if those more social streams, help them realize, like, how interesting and positive it can be to connect with, like, a community of people that follow your work and that you don't normally get to, like, talk to one-on-one.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that is having a positive impact on the way that devs see streaming and YouTube and the way that they conduct their relationships with those people. Like, I hope that it can become more than just, like, transactional, like, here's a key, can you stream my game? Like, hopefully there can be more of a engagement between those two communities because more game developers are engaging with the platform in a personal way.
So
does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, here's something that's kind of related. Like, are there nuances of, and this is such a nebulous thing too, but like, are there nuances of video game culture that you think mainstream culture, like are there nuances that, like, you feel mainstream culture, like, still misunderstands about video game culture, or maybe willfully doesn't want to understand about video game culture? I'm not pointing to anything. Yeah, I'm not pointing to anything specific. I'm just sort of throwing it out there.
I feel like it's a hard question for me because I am so deep in, like, games industry stuff and now Twitch stuff that I wonder if I'm even able to, like, see that view anymore because I'm so deep in.
Yeah.
But I think I hope, like, with, I've been following, for example, Gary Whitta's work with his, like, Animal Crossing interview stream, and he's been, like, getting more and more celebrities coming on and stuff, and, like, I don't think we need celebrities to, like, improve games culture or whatever, but I do think it'll attract new crowds of people to, like, see what Twitch is and see Gary Whitta, who's like a perfectly pleasant person streaming on the platform and conducting these like really cool interviews with cool people.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, doing a good job of like having celebrities on and having just like people on Twitch on there. I saw I'm trying to remember her name. Anyway, I've discovered some new streamers just that he's had on as musical guests on his show that have been really interesting. So I think he's doing something really cool, helping those worlds cross a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I see something like that, like a step in the right direction, and hopefully the way more people see the platform as a place that's not just like ragey gamers or whatever.
Yeah, which I guess in some circles that would be, you would assume one word from hearing the other.
So yeah, and I'm like, there are those people. I won't like deny it, and I feel like I should like recommend. I keep talking about how there are these like streamers that are not like that. I'll just give an example. I was watching a stream the other day, Vanna, Vana. She's a really wonderful streamer, and she was actually playing through the last game that I worked on, We Met in May, which is like a collection of vignette games about dates Jake and I have been on with my partner. And she played that, and her audience was super like positive and into it, and it was such a joy to see. And she does like indie game Mondays and stuff, and I really love her stream. There's also Nega Oryx, who's been really blowing up. I love Kung Fu Fruit Cup. These are just like, if you're curious about these streams that I watch that I'm kind of referring to, those are a couple examples. Mm-hmm. And Okadrian as well, who streams, and he's like a GameStop host, maybe both, I forget. His stream's really good. He's been streaming Nightcall and other games. So those are just so people can like have something to look at after this if they want to.
Right. No, I appreciate that, because I think, you know what you're referring to, but others not in your head don't. I have just a couple more questions here. I'm kind of ambivalent about it, and I meant to bring it up earlier, but you had sort of mentioned that, I'll just quote from your email, you said that you are, quote, extremely bored of people asking you why sex is so poorly addressed and presented in games. And so I hate to ask you a thing that, as you say in an email, like, I hate to ask you anything about a thing that you're extremely bored of. But it brought to mind another quote, though, from like a soldier in Sweden who I interviewed 5 years ago now, who observed that, like, sex in big budget games, this is another weird dichotomy of like budgets and how games are. I'll just read you this quote, and maybe you'll have a reaction to it, or maybe there will be a better question that'll come out of it. But he said that basically, like, in these games, quote, courtship sums up to, quote, give presents until someone will have sex with you. There, the courtship stops. There's no more relationship. You had sex. You've reached the goal. So I don't know if the question is like, do you think sex in games can be presented in an even more boring fashion?
I mean, the transactional depiction of it is like pretty, I feel like it's one of those things where I feel like that conversation has happened so many times, and that's why I feel bored about it, because I'm like, we all know, like, transactional sex in games in that way is, like, not interesting. Like, we've had that conversation. We know it's bad and dumb and annoying. So when I say I'm really bored of it, it's because I'm bored of the question, and I wish people would ask for more examples that do it well, so that they can go find the games that are pushing those boundaries and that are, coming up with new game design ideas around that topic that are cool. So, like, I always, what are the ones that I reference a lot? Lady Killer in a Bind is a really interesting example from Christine Love. Uta from Leah Schoenfelder is another really good example of sex in a game that's not transactional, and that is, these are games that are looking at it from, like, in a more nuanced way. Also, I love to recommend Well, This Is Awkward, which is a game that Emma Kidwell made about going to the store to get condoms in the middle of a date. That's another really interesting, more nuanced way of looking at an aspect of sex. So I think, like, that's why I say I'm bored of the question, because I'd rather just, like, talk about the games that are doing interesting things and, like, we can just stop talking about Mass Effect now. We know that it's not super interesting in those games. Those games are still beloved. Like, I love playing those games, but, like, it's almost like we talked about it too much. Like, let's talk about the other stuff now.
Right. That's more my hesitation in bringing it up. I mean, I think the question, like, I didn't know if your boredom, I think it was connected with that. Like, you're tired of talking about those games less than being asked about it. But
yeah. Well, I think the other side of it is, like, sometimes I wonder, I think maybe I've been pigeonholed a little bit because I don't only make games about sex.
Yeah. I was going to ask, like, how is it that you became the go-to person for people to ask that question?
Yeah, I guess because of How Do You Do It and Sybil, which were, like, the two first things that, like, I guess made me more visible. It's because of that, I'm sure, but I've worked on a lot of stuff since that has nothing to do with sex.
Right.
So someday it'll stop, but maybe not until something I work on blows up bigger than those, which that might not even happen, so maybe I'm just cursed.
Yeah, that was my other hesitation. That was my other hesitation in bringing it up, was if even just to ask, like, oh, are there aspects of sexuality you would like to see be more present in games? But, like, I wouldn't even write that question down because it's like, well... I don't know. It's a weird thing how you wind up pigeonholing yourself without trying to.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a question
unfortunate.
there. I don't have a question there.
No. The other game I'd recommend is Anodyne 2. I saw you interviewed Melos,
yes.
And I'm such a big fan of that game. And that game also has some elements of it that are more nuanced look at sex and sexuality and stuff. So that's another really good one to play. Everyone play Anodyne 2. It's the best.
For sure, yes. So I'll rewind further back then to... this will be my second to last question for you, which is so before those games that you mentioned. I mean, you said that you would be a different person today if you hadn't grown up playing online games with strangers on the internet or fantasy soap opera RPGs, as you called them. How do you think you would be different if you didn't have those in your life from a young age?
I think for me, at least. As far as it relates to the online games, I played Final Fantasy XI. I started when I was 14, and I played it, like, super a lot until I was about 18 or 19. Mm-hmm. And so, I still had, like, a social life at school and stuff through middle school and high school, and, like, I wasn't a total shut-in or anything, but I actually had more of my, like, formative experiences around, like, romance and, like, social circle drama and stuff. All of that stuff happened for me in Final Fantasy XI and not so much in real life. So, which I think definitely, like, changes how you experience that stuff. Like, having interpersonal drama over the internet is, in many ways, similar to real life, but also there's this, like, the element of, like, the mediation of screens or whatever, right. And like the lack of physical body language and stuff. I think that definitely changes it. So I don't know how I'd be different.
Yeah,
maybe
it's kind of a ridiculous question because how could you know?
It's hard to say. Like, I think actually one important thing is that I might not be as open about putting my personal stories out there in games. I think that I really became comfortable, like, expressing myself to people via keyboard and whatnot as, like, literally, like, during my most formative years, right? Like, starting when I was 14. And I think that experience maybe helped me be more open through digital means. I imagine if I hadn't had those experiences, I might be less of a personal game maker, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to that as far as, like, it sort of being a playground or a space when you're young to learn to express yourself and learn more about yourself and learn to socialize with other people. And it's kind of like a digital equivalent of having pen pals, but you hear from them much more often. I don't know why I had this expectation when I was about that age. I just sort of felt like, well, when we're adults, we're not going to use, instant message anymore. I don't know why I thought that.
If anything, you ended up being very right.
Yeah, if anything, it turns out there's more of it now than there was then.
Yeah. We're on Discord. It's come full circle in many ways. Like, I was on IRC as a kid, and now Discord is like IRC for me.
IRC.
So it's all come full circle.
Yes. ICQ, the Palace. Like, I didn't realize how many of these are actually kind of deep cut references. I just thought everyone knew about. But IRC, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so I have one last question for you. Is there something you wanted to bring up that I didn't give you a chance to? Because I know we jumped around quite a bit.
I don't think so. It's just fun to talk about the Twitch stuff because, like, it's a conversation I don't think I've been able to have on many of, like, these sort of, like, interviewee things I do because I feel like often people understandably want to talk to me more about my game stuff, but Twitch streaming has become such a big part of my life, too, that I'm glad to be able to, like, bring that perspective to the table finally.
Good. No, I'm glad to.
It's really important to me and something I think that's not talked about enough in, like, game sphere and game developer sphere.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad. I'm always interested to hear about it too. So yeah, last question I have for you, which is kind of another one that's kind of hard to answer, but what do you feel video games have accomplished?
My instinct is to say nothing, but obviously that's not true. It's just a funny response that I could give.
I can tell you, because I've been asking that question for a couple of years, and I've noticed a pattern. I think the question is more like, well, what do you think of this as a question? But I've noticed for some reason, most people either do what you just did, or they'll laugh and then say everything.
Yeah. I wonder if it's like this habit, it's like this, like, I wonder if games has this, like, self-deprecating culture to it, like game developer culture, where we're like, a lot of us are like, God, gamer culture's so bad, so it's, like, hard for us to say that games are doing anything good, because a lot of that, like, toxic gamer culture stuff is so visible, so it makes us want to self-deprecate. But I think it's important, like, to piggyback on what I was saying earlier, that there's, like, a lot of people doing really good things in the space, and, like, even though there is bad people being shitty, like, there's also good people making interesting work about, like we were saying before, about sexuality. Those people I referenced. There's also those streamers I was referencing that have really, like, positive, interesting communities that talk about things with nuance. And, like, so I also have the habit of wanting to self-deprecate, but it's important to remember that there's more there than just that. And games are having a positive impact on a lot of people's lives, both professionally and personally. Yeah. Cool. It is a big question, though. But I think, actually, one thing I do want to mention again with the streaming stuff is it's just amazing to see the power of being able to, even though, like, a streamer's on the screen and the chat is just talking to them in text, it's amazing to see, like, the ways people can connect through games in that way when we're able to just, like, talk about it directly instead of just, like, tweeting into the void and, like, being overwhelmed by reply guys or whatever. It's cool to see streamers, like, engaging in those conversations one-on-one, and, you know, occasionally there's the bad egg that comes in and you ban, but so often there's, like, really the ability to have meaningful conversations with people and, like, connect and be happy playing games together. So I think that a lot of the most positive stuff I've seen has been in the Twitch space because we're able to talk to each other directly. So I think that's one good thing games have done. It's, like, it's definitely a positive social impact. It's definitely like a very opt-in kind of environment. So I think although obviously I'm sure just between the two of us we've heard about a fair amount of, you know, drama in those spaces. It's definitely not as grabby to talk about, like, the stuff that you're talking about, which I would argue is probably why those spaces exist, but that's seldom articulated. Yeah, I mean, people just want to be friends. Like, that's why, like, online internet is even a thing, because we just want to communicate. Like, so much of the history of technology has just been, how do we get people to, like, talk to each other more? Right. And games enable that in lots of different ways. Twitch is just one of them. MMOs is another. And I think it's easy to forget that, like, that stuff is really positive. There should be better moderation for that stuff always, like kick Nazis off the platform and everything. but there's also, like, as long as that stuff is good and stable, we can have these, like, really positive social spaces. And I always want to remind people of that. Like, you're in a stream, like, say hi. It's probably going to go well, and you might make a friend. And I think that's awesome.